We have another wonderful general session right now, PSC and the future. Our first moderator, Dr. David Goldberg, is Assistant Professor of Medicine, Assistant Professor of Epidemiology, Medical Director of Living Donor Liver Transplantation at the University of Pennsylvania. He spends 20% of his time doing clinical work caring for patients with liver disease across the entire spectrum, with a special focus on PSC. The other 80% of his time is spent doing research, including analyses of large databases, observational studies, and clinical trials of patients, including PSC. Dr. Cynthia Levy currently serves as the Program Director for the Transplant Hepatology Fellowship at the University of Miami and is the Assistant Director for the Schiff Center for Liver Diseases. Her interests include adult cholestatic liver diseases, especially PBC and PSC, with a focus on clinical trial development.
Thank you, Ricky. This was wonderful. Welcome back to the third session on PSC and the future. We're going to kick off with Dr. Bertus Eksteen, who's going to be talking to us about concepts and key issues specific to PSC transplant assessment and planning. So we will discuss indications, management, assessment of patients.
Thank you, Cynthia. So I'm going to run through quite a few different concepts here. And I'm going to go from very basic things to quite complex things because I realize that people in the audience, some have never thought about transplant, have no idea what that involves, and other people are actually part of transplant programs at present and have a lot more experience of this. So we're going to try and adapt this so everybody gets a flavor for what we're talking about. And yep, it's coming up. Okay, so I think whenever I see somebody and we start thinking about transplantation, there's generally three considerations that comes into this. And this is regardless of whether you're in PSC or alcoholic liver disease or anything. The big thing is a transplant required? You know, do you need a transplant? What is your benefit from that? And that's not always that easy. And in PSC, I'll show you later on, that's a particularly difficult question to answer sometimes. There's a variety of scoring systems out there, MELD, sodium MELD, UCALD, and I'll talk to you a little bit what that means. And then, there you go. And then there's variant syndromes. And variant syndromes in most transplant systems are defined as things that are not measured well by these scoring systems. The next thing is not just do you need a transplant, but can you actually survive the transplant? Okay, and that's a workup, that's a cardiovascular workup. It looks at the other things that might be wrong with your body. Can we actually get you through a transplant? And that's both an immediate question, can we do it short term, get you alive through a transplant, but also longer term. And most units will have a rule along the lines of saying, if we're going to do this, we want to have a reasonable expectation that somebody's going to be alive 5 years down the road. Transplantation is a limited resource, and so we have to try and use it to the best possible way. And then there's another concern, and the last one is an eligibility concern. And that is, not so much in the PSC world, but, are there drug addictions we have to deal with? Are there alcohol addictions we have to deal with? As a whole, the PSC population do not have many issues surrounding this, but a major issue that does come up is who's going to look after you after your transplant? What is your social makeup at home? After a transplant, there might be a year where you don't work. How are you going to get through all of that? So it's not a contraindication to transplantation, but it's something we need to understand and plan for. And then when we come to predicting a transplant, when to do this, this is a really key thing. Okay? We don't do prophylactic transplants. That is not what we do. We do a transplant when really your likelihood of dying within 1 year exceeds the risk of dying from the transplant. That's really where the line is drawn in the sand. And for most transplant centers, your chance of dying within a year of a transplant is around 10, maybe 12%. That's what most centers will quote. And that's a general thing. So generally, if your chance of surviving is worse than that through a year, then that's when a transplant should be offered. That's generally what we're thinking about. And we have to think about comorbidities. All these other things come into it. There's always a lot of questions surrounding cholangiocarcinoma. Can't we just do a transplant to take away the cholangiocarcinoma risk? And that's a very bad thing. for multiple reasons, because the annual risk of cholangiocarcinoma is much, much lower than the risk of dying from a transplant. And you can still do a transplant, and some of the remnants that remain get a cholangiocarcinoma. So it's not curative from that point of view. So we don't do prophylactic transplants, but it really, this risk-benefit ratio is what most people want to try and capture when we talk about it. I think we have to think about equitable access. Okay, transplantation is a difficult thing, and when we have to pick, do you give a liver to somebody who's older or somebody who's a child, or who do you give a liver to? It becomes very, very difficult. And I think most of the surveys that have done out there, and it's people from the public that donate livers, it's not a medical decision to make. You have to see what's acceptable for members of the public. Most people will say, give it to a child. So most transplant systems will preferentially prioritize children to get transplants first, and I think everybody is great to that. But beyond that, we have to think about equitable access for everybody else. Liver transplantation is a rare resource. You can't sue and say it's my human right to get a transplant. That's been tried, doesn't work, because really there isn't enough. It's not like water. There isn't a lot of livers around. So we have to be careful how we use it. And it's assigning a minimum benefit that somebody's going to gain from this. Okay, and really that sort of 50% 5-year bar most people will sign up to. It's not what everybody will get a benefit. If I told you you've got a 5% chance of surviving a transplant, that person will say, I'll go for that. But in the bigger scheme, that is not fair to everybody else waiting for a transplant. So we have to be equitable. And it's very difficult because I'm split between seeing the patient in front of me and thinking about everybody else in the wait list. So it puts everybody in transplantation always at odds, at a variety of things. And the reality of our liver transplantation lists in the Alberta program is that really for every 2 people we transplant on the waiting list, 3 people will die. So we have to make, it's tough decisions to make, but we have to give the best person the chance to survive and say when it's the right decision to make. As far as transplantation and what we use, there's lots of nomenclature around that, and that has got implications for what do we use. And so the traditional transplant is somebody who gets a head injury, they're in a car crash, and they die after brain death. And that's most of the organs that's traditionally been used, and that's a DBD liver. These are limited supply. We all wear ski helmets when we go skiing. We all wear seat belts. I mean, it's been a disaster for the transplant programs. Ban these things, please. So that's been a problem. But we don't, this pool of organ donors have gone down and down and down and down. So this has been a diminishing resource. And it has been probably the best liver to get because you get a whole liver. It comes out of a very well-controlled environment. And these used to be very good organs to get. But they are, as I say, diminishing that supply. We've moved over to using different types of organs now as well. And this is using an organ once somebody's heart has stopped. And they're called DCD livers. Now, this is still a whole liver that you get. The only problem is, as you're waiting for somebody's heart to stop, their blood pressure goes slowly down, slowly down, slowly down. And depending on how long this happens, it means this liver has been underperfused for quite a bit of time. So it does sustain some injury, but it's a whole organ and it works well, but it's not as good as a DBD transplant. And then this is really what PSC is all about these days, is living-related liver donation. Okay? And this is really one way of guaranteeing that you're getting a transplant. This is what I tell all my PSC patients. It's when I see you in clinic for liver transplantation, bring your donor with you. This really takes you out of the lottery of being on a waiting list. We can plan things better, but there are limitations to this. And we have to be careful about this. You're only getting half a liver. So if you're too sick, this is not going to be the right thing for you. There's a stage where your liver disease is too sick and half a liver is not going to cut it. There are risks to the donor. And throughout this whole process, I really like my patients, but I really like their donors even more. I cannot afford for a donor to come to harm. So we have to be mindful of that. And for most programs, you can only be eligible for living donation if you're eligible for the other forms of donation. And the reason for that is, if we do a living-related transplant on you today, and that liver doesn't take within 24 hours for whatever reason, we have to save your life giving you one of these other transplants. So you have to be eligible for that. So most systems will require that you can go onto the regular list first and then be assessed for living transplantation. And then the recovery after LRDs is sometimes a bit longer because of the complexity of the surgery. So as to how do we pick people, when should we transplant? And so the problem with this, particularly for PSC, is that most of the scoring systems look at diseases that affect the hepatocytes themselves. So if you have hepatitis C, hepatitis B, alcoholic liver cirrhosis that affects the hepatocyte cells themselves, then these scoring systems are really valid for you. The MELD score, the Child-Pugh score, all those ones. But they don't capture the biliary diseases quite so well. And so I'll run you through some of these scoring systems just to give you a flavor of what they are. The initial one that was used is a Child-Pugh score. It gives you points depending on some of your lab values. These values are really related to how many hepatocytes you've got and how well they're functioning. And capture things such as bilirubin, albumin, your clotting times, ascites and encephalopathy. And that then gives you a point system. And you can make prediction of survival with 1 year based on this. And this was a very crude system, but it's still used quite a bit to assign how sick people are. And this has been surpassed eventually by a thing called the MELD score. And the MELD score you've heard a lot about. It is a compound score. It also uses bilirubin, clotting, and creatinine in a complex formula. And you can draw a line as to what your predicted survival is at 3 months. Okay, so this looks at 3 months. And generally when people become right for transplant, their MELD score sits around 14 to 19. That's sort of the sweet spot where your risk of death without a transplant exceeds the risk of a transplant. So that's sort of generally where the MELD score kicks in. And then that has been modified even further to look at other parameters such as what the sodium in your blood's doing. And because what happens is the more severe your liver disease, quite often your sodium goes down. So that's been added to the scoring system, and you'll come across things which is called sodium MELD. And a lot of systems have moved forward to that, as that also predicts mortality. But where PSC often sits is somebody with a low MELD score or a low sodium MELD, because it just doesn't capture the disease all that accurately, and they've got a variant syndrome. And this is a problem, because we can list patients based on this, but it's difficult to predict how sick you are. And so traditionally, the ones that we use is refractory ascites. Your MELD score might be low, but you've got lots of ascites that we cannot deal with anymore. We're talking about hepatic encephalopathy. Some people will have preserved liver function, but just completely comatose all the time. And it's difficult to say, how does that relate to your mortality? Malignancy is relatively easy. We talk about that. Refractory itching as a sole indication for transplantation. We do that, not very often, but it can be an indication. Refractory cholangitis. PSC patients get cholangitis. Eventually, people end up on rotating antibiotics. And if you like, some of my patients, you live in hospital for 9 months on intravenous antibiotics. So, that person really benefits from a transplant. But how do you assign risk to that? And then there's metabolic diseases, which is really not applicable to PSC. So it's difficult. And what we practically do in the transplant system is we'll arbitrarily assign a MELD score to these patients. We'll say, okay, you've got one of these diseases. We don't know how to classify it. We're going to give you 22 points. And then maybe in 3 months we'll revisit that to say, are you better, the same, or worse? If you're the same, you don't get extra points. If you are worse, we can give you extra points and compare you to other people on the list. But it's very arbitrary, and people don't like that, because various people will say this is fair, people will say this is not fair. And that makes it a bit of a lottery, especially for PSC patients. So bring your own donor, bring your LRD. It takes you out of this problem. And so what we're dealing with is apples and oranges here. We've got one scoring system that works for a lot of liver diseases and a lot of other diseases where it just doesn't fit. And that's really one of the biggest challenges around PSC, is to have a scoring system that we can run side by side with MELD score or any of those ones to really give a good indication as to what to do next. There are things out there. The PSC, the Mayo PSC risk score is out there. It does give a prediction of high risk of bad outcomes or medium risk of bad outcomes. And it does start to capture some things. It gives you hints as to what's important in PSC. And things like age play a part in this. Varices, the presence of varices or bleeding varices is important. Generally, when one of my PSC patients have varices, I start thinking, well, 2 or 3 years down the line from this, we need to start thinking about a transplant. So it is a heads up in PSC. and it captures liver inflammation. So there are PSC-specific things, but we need to improve on that. And because of all this worries as to how do people actually do this, what is equitable? If you're a PSC patient here today and you come from all over the world, what is the norm? What happens out there? So a few years ago through the International PSC Study Group, we sent a questionnaire around just to get an idea of what do people do globally for PSC around liver transplantation. And so we sent out 14 questions, used SurveyMonkey, got 33 responses from 12 countries. And I'll run you through some of these findings that we had from this. And so the first thing is a lot of places use the MELT score. And it's because there's a lot of US centers, Canada, the UK used to use MELT. It's a common scoring system that gets used. And so that's pretty much the baseline. Quite a few have moved over to a sodium MELT, and the UCAL score, which is the UK score, is also a type of sodium MELT in many ways. Some places still use the older child due score, and some places use no scoring system. And so some of those where people will just say, well, I think you need a transplant, yes or no. And this is, if I'm a patient, this worries me because it does mean how I get selected where I live in the world is not uniform. And then we moved forward into this and said, well, okay, are there minimum criteria that you have to hit to be transplanted? So, as I told you, it's a balance between predicted mortality from transplant or without transplant. And rather interestingly, that is almost a 50-50 split. So it is difficult to have comfort if you know there's such a difficulty out there. Now, because PSC really falls under these variant syndromes where you can count things such as cancer, recurrent cholangitis, all those things as potential indications. We looked at whether this is allowed in the certain systems. So are people using this as a way of listing patients for liver transplantation? And certainly recurrent bacterial cholangitis came up. I think 75% of centers were able to use that as an indication. But other things didn't come up. They couldn't use colonic dysplasia, for instance, or severe malnutrition, or encephalopathy ascites. So there's variability as to the leeway that some centers have to use these other features of PSC to list patients for transplantation. And I think what limits that is how the transplant systems are set up. So transplant systems where the local team can make that decision based on the patient in front of them, they're able to do these things, whereas other centers have to abide by national guidelines, where this can only be made at an arm's length by a different organization. And so that takes away that communication with the patient. Now, overall, both strategies have merits. I can make the best decision for my patient in front of me, but if I do that decision, I might disadvantage somebody else's patient. So that's potentially the problem there. And that's why there's national systems in some countries to try and have it equitable, but then individual patients, and particularly PSC patients, I think can be disadvantaged. So we have to strike a balance between these two different ways of doing things. And then as to how often can you give extra points? And so some systems said, well, they only can give it once and that's it. Some can do it on a case-by-case basis repeatedly, and others would just do it at routine intervals. So every 3 months, you'd get an upgrade on your MELT automatically until you get transplanted. So there's great variability out there, which I think is one of the challenges to us to address. The big thing about living donation is it's a difficult surgery, and not every center offers it because you have to do enough numbers to be good at it. And so we wanted to get a good idea of who uses living donation and who uses the death after cardiac death, donation after cardiac death livers. And so luckily the majority of liver centers are starting to use LRD livers now that are involved in PSC care. Quite a few of them will offer it to PSC patients. And then the DCD livers, a lot of them get used. People don't use a lot of them for PSC, and I think one of the biggest problem is if you've had a liver that's had a long ischemia time, so they've had a slow drop-off in perfusion, they're more prone to biliary complications, and if you've already got a disease involving the bile ducts, maybe that's not such a good match. So that's what's being used out there. And really the summary of the survey was that really there's great variability. And it really highlights the fact that we need some sort of better scoring system to capture how sick a PSC patient is, and then bring that on as a standard across the world. And I think to do that, we need to understand what is the real impact on some of these variant syndromes. So if you get recurrent cholangitis, you're all the time in hospital getting antibiotics. What does that mean compared to an alcoholic with a MELD score of 25? What's equal and what's fair in that system? And that's really, I think, the challenge for us to walk towards that, and something that has to be easy to use. Now, if you're lucky enough to get a transplant, it's a good thing. It gets you through that first period. The majority of people will survive. It's generally a good thing for PSC. But a proportion of people will get PSC back. And this graph over here, this is looking at recurrence and loss of graft through time. And the worst of all the diseases used to be hepatitis C. Okay, it came back, chew up grafts, and those grafts are useless. Hepatitis C is pretty much cured. So the next one down is PSC. And this is both an opportunity and a challenge. Because yes, we need to do things better to prevent recurrent PSC. But if we're the bad boy out here in the transplant world, people will say, hey, it's not worthwhile transplanting you because you're going to lose this liver. So it asks questions both ways. So it means we really need to understand who's going to get this back. And if it does come back, how do we change this outcome? Because the reality is most PSC patients are young. And if I give you a liver today and you're 20 and you're going to get it again in 8 years and need another liver transplant and another liver transplant, then your long-term outlook, you're not going to get to 80 years old. And that's a problem. So we need to be very clear as to how we manage these things. I think the bowel is important in this. This is all data from Birmingham, where they looked at what happens if you remove the colon before surgery, before transplant. And these people really didn't get much PSC back. Now, the problem with this data, this was in the days before we had biological drugs to treat inflammatory bowel disease. And this data is almost impossible to generate at this stage again. So I think the colon and maybe the IBD that goes along with PSC is the key thing here. And if you look at a lot of studies that look at predictors of recurrent PSC, active inflammatory bowel disease comes up all the time. And the difficulty in PSC is that you often have a gastroenterologist that manages the IBD, hepatologist that manages the PSC, and there's not enough talk between the two. And really this has to be a healthy partnership to say, we're going to do the best thing for the liver to transplant, but we have to treat the IBD properly. And I suspect it probably means adjusting our bar for treating it. So a few things about recurrent PSC. I think it's worthwhile thinking that a transplant doesn't cure PSC, it can come back. And it doesn't cure cholangiocarcinoma either. I mean, you can have remnants of your bile duct, it remains, and you can get cholangiocarcinoma back. So it is a life-saving procedure, but it's not necessarily a long-term cure. There's many things that impact this. So donor factors absolutely impact this. The age of your donor liver, was it a liver that had a long ischemic time, low perfusion, had biliary complications, all those things impact this. The type of transplant, I think, is, there's great livers and there's not so good livers. If you're at death's door, you'll have every liver you can find. I mean, you can't pick at that stage, but that does have an impact. And the one thing that we talk a lot about, and we're really not sure what this means, is when we do living donation, it's okay to have a liver from a friend because they're not genetically related to you. But what happens if you have a liver from a sibling that potentially have the same genes for PSC as you have? Is there a higher risk of getting PSC? And there's some data to suggest yes and no, and I don't think we really understand that yet. But it's things that are theoretical, but we need to think about it. We talked about age of transplant, and the problem with, as you follow PSC forward, it's always difficult to say, is this rejection or recurrent PSC? So I think it's always a difficulty knowing exactly what we're dealing with when your alkaline phos goes up after transplant. But I think my big message is the activity of the IBD has to be controlled. I think that's a key thing. And we need to define what that endpoint is. Traditionally, IBD has been treated to take your symptoms away. So if you have no symptoms, your IBD is controlled. I think IBD is changing sufficient to say that that's no longer the output for this. We need to look with a colonoscopy and make sure it's healed up. So mucosal healing is probably the new endpoint for IBD, and I would suggest in a PSC patient that is probably the endpoint. Your mucosa has to be healed up, otherwise it's not well treated. And I think that highlights really the older data of the surgical colectomies versus a chemical colectomy, which is a medication-induced control of your inflammatory bowel disease. So in summary, I think it's important to understand the correct timing of a transplant. We can do just as much harm as good if we get our timing wrong. It's, for some people, not a cure. I think we really understand there's a lot of specific things around PSC which we have to bring into the conversation. And the only difficulty for PSC physician is how do we make that equitable to other people needing transplants out there. I think we need a better model that actually speaks to PSC needs. And I think, honestly, everybody needs to sign up as an organ donor. So spread the word. This really saves lives. Thank you.